A magnitude 5.7 earthquake just cracked the seafloor 85 miles off the coast of Oregon. 2 hours later, a cluster of smaller quakes hit the coast of Northern California. Scientists stared at their monitors. The shaking came from a corner of the ocean floor where 3 tectonic plates grind against each other, and where the last full rupture sent a wave all the way to Japan. We are going to cover the ghost forests it left behind, the towns that could permanently drop below sea level, and the theory that 2 of America's deadliest faults could fire at the same time. If you enjoy the journey, subscribe and stay with us. Prepare yourselves. We begin. The call came before sunrise. A magnitude 5.7 earthquake had just cracked the seafloor 85 miles off the coast of Pistol River, Oregon. No buildings shook, no windows broke. Most people on the west coast slept right through it. But inside seismic monitoring stations, up and down the coast, every screen lit up at once. Seismologists stared at the data. The location was what got their attention. The quake had not happened somewhere random in the deep ocean. It had struck right along the edge of the Gorda Plate, one of the most geologically tense pieces of crust on the planet. And within 2 hours of that first jolt, a rapid cluster of smaller quakes began firing off the coast of Northern California, one after another, like a row of dominoes tipping in slow motion. A cluster like this is called a swarm. Swarms happen all the time offshore. Most of them mean nothing. The ocean floor is restless, always shifting, always releasing tiny bursts of pressure. Scientists log them, file them, and move on. But this swarm was different. The location placed it directly above the locked interface of the most dangerous fault on the west coast, and the timing added something that made the data harder to dismiss. The 2026 swarm did not come out of nowhere. Months of offshore sensors had been tracking a slow creeping rise in regional seismic activity along the same stretch of the Pacific coast. Individual quakes, minor ones, had been nudging upward in frequency, each one small enough to ignore on its own. Together they drew a pattern that seismologists had seen before. The last time a cluster this concentrated appeared near this particular tectonic boundary, the geological record showed something far larger had followed. That record goes back centuries. Scientists read it not from historical newspapers, but from the ground itself. Layers of mud on the seafloor, sediment cores pulled from coastal marshes, and rings inside ancient buried trees all carry the signature of past seismic events. Each major rupture leaves a fingerprint, and the fingerprints along this stretch of coastline tell a story of repeated catastrophes spaced roughly every 450 to 500 years. The math on that cycle is uncomfortable. The last full rupture of this fault happened in the year 1700. That means over 325 years have already passed. The historical window for the next one is open. Scientists are careful not to say it is overdue, because faults do not run on perfect schedules, but they are equally careful not to say the region is safe. The morning the monitors lit up, a team at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network began running rapid analysis on the cluster. They needed to answer one question fast. Was this swarm a simple mechanical release of stress, a routine adjustment between plates, or was it something the scientific community dreads and cannot yet reliably detect in real time? A foreshock. A foreshock looks identical to a standalone earthquake right up until the moment the main event arrives. By then, the warning is already over. Nobody on the west coast felt the 5.7 that morning. Life continued normally. Coffee shops opened, highways filled with cars, kids went to school. But 85 miles offshore, something had shifted. Pressure that had been locked in place for decades had moved, and that movement sent a signal through the crust that scientists are still trying to decode. The plate responsible for all of it sits directly beneath the ocean floor, just off the Oregon coast. To understand what the swarm actually means, you need to understand what that plate is, where it came from, and why it is so dangerous. Picture a slow collision that has been happening for millions of years. Off the coast of Oregon and Northern California, a relatively small piece of ocean crust called the Gorda Plate is moving eastward. It travels at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, slow enough that you would never notice it in a lifetime, fast enough that over millions of years it has reshaped an entire coastline. As it moves east, the Gorda Plate runs directly into the North American continent. The two cannot occupy the same space. Something has to give. So the Gorda Plate does what heavier ocean crust always does when it meets lighter continental crust. It dives underneath. Geologists call this process subduction. The plate bends downward and slides beneath North America at an angle, pushing deeper into the earth the farther it goes. That downward slide sounds gradual and orderly. It rarely is. The interface where the Gorda Plate meets the underside of North America does not move smoothly. The two surfaces lock together, gripping each other with enormous friction across a zone that stretches hundreds of miles. Think of pressing two pieces of rough sandpaper together and trying to slide one past the other. The rougher the surfaces, the more force you need to get movement. And the longer they stay locked, the more energy builds up between them. The Gorda Plate has been locked against the North American plate for a very long time. Pressure from its eastward movement has nowhere to go, so it stores. Every year the plate keeps moving. Another small increment of energy gets added to a system that has been accumulating stress for over 3 centuries. Here is what makes the Gorda Plate specifically dangerous compared to other subduction zones around the world. Its geometry is unusual. The plate is relatively young in geological terms, which makes it denser and more rigid than older, cooler ocean crust. That rigidity means it does not flex or absorb stress gradually. It holds it, and the section of the plate sitting directly below the earthquake cluster of 2026 is one of the most mechanically stressed pieces of ocean floor on the entire west coast. The swarm from Chapter 1 hit at the edge of this plate, right at the seam where it begins its downward dive. Scientists call this the subduction interface. The precise location of the swarm told seismologists something specific. The stress was not releasing from deep inside the Earth. It was releasing at the shallow, locked portion of the interface, the section that, in a worst-case scenario, is the first part to rupture in a major earthquake. That detail matters enormously. Deep quakes on a subduction plate often signal routine plate movement at depth. Shallow quakes along the locked interface are the ones that worry scientists most. They happen closer to the surface. They radiate energy more efficiently upward through the crust, and a rupture starting in that shallow zone carries far more destructive potential than anything happening miles below. Beneath the swarm, locked against North America, the Gorda Plate had been building that pressure for 325 years. The cluster had released a fraction of it. A small fraction. The real question was not what the cluster released. The question was what it left behind. And sitting right at the corner where the Gorda Plate, the Pacific Plate, and the North American Plate all meet, a geological feature existed that made the whole situation stranger and more volatile than any single fault could produce on its own. There is a place in the ocean off the coast of Northern California where 3 of the largest tectonic plates on Earth meet at a single point. Stand at that point, hypothetically, and you would have the Pacific Plate to your west, the North American Plate to your east, and the Gorda Plate wedging in from the north. 3 massive pieces of the planet's crust, each moving in a different direction, each carrying a different type of geological stress, all converging on one location. Scientists call it the Mendocino Triple Junction, named after the coastal California town closest to where this meeting point sits on the ocean floor. Triple junctions exist in a few places around the world. Most are relatively stable, the plates meeting at angles that allow motion to distribute somewhat evenly. The Mendocino Triple Junction is the opposite. The geometry here is chaotic. The Pacific Plate moves northwest. The North American Plate moves roughly southwest relative to the Pacific. The Gorda Plate is being compressed from both sides while simultaneously diving underneath North America. The result is a zone of constant, overlapping geological violence that generates more frequent earthquakes per square mile than almost anywhere else on the West Coast. Every earthquake cluster that fires near this junction is complicated by the fact that stress from 3 different plate systems feeds into the same region. A quake on the Gorda Plate can redistribute force onto the edge of the Pacific Plate. Stress from the Pacific Plate can accelerate movement along the locked Cascadia interface. The systems interact, none of them operate in clean isolation. The 2026 cluster originated close to this junction. That location made interpretation harder. When an earthquake fires at the intersection of 3 separate plate systems, scientists cannot immediately assign it to one fault or one mechanism. The swarm could reflect stress release on the Gorda Plate alone. It could signal movement along the deeper locked interface. It could represent adjustment along the Mendocino Fracture Zone, the massive east-west transform fault that forms the southern boundary between the Gorda and Pacific plates. Each of those possibilities carries a different level of concern. For the first 24 hours after the cluster, monitoring teams ran the seismic wave data through multiple models simultaneously. The depth of each quake mattered, the wave pattern mattered, the direction of fault movement mattered. In a region this complex, a single data point can point in 3 different directions at once. What made the Mendocino Triple Junction globally significant beyond its local danger was the long history of seismic events it had already produced. Research into the geological record around this junction revealed cycles of activity going back tens of thousands of years. Clusters appeared, then quieted, then reappeared. Some clustered periods preceded larger regional earthquakes, some did not. The record was clear enough to show the pattern existed. It was not yet clear enough to say what the pattern predicted. 30 miles beneath the ocean surface, somewhere under all that water and rock, the plates kept moving, and to the north, stretching 600 miles up the coast toward Canada, the largest subduction fault in the contiguous United States ran silently beneath the seafloor. It had been locked for 3 centuries. It had produced an earthquake so massive that evidence of it was found carved into the coastlines of Japan, and everything happening at the Mendocino Triple Junction sat at its southern tip, feeding stress directly into its base. Every seismologist watching the 2026 cluster faced the same problem. They could see the swarm clearly, they could measure each quake, map its location, calculate its depth, and model which direction the fault had moved. The instruments were precise. The data was clean. But the one thing the data could not tell them, the one thing they needed most, was whether the swarm was finished. An earthquake swarm can be 2 things. The first is a sequence of stress release events, small quakes that release accumulated pressure in gradual bursts without triggering anything larger. These happen constantly along active fault zones. They are part of the normal mechanics of plate tectonics. The crust adjusts, energy escapes in manageable amounts, and the region stabilizes. The second possibility is a foreshock sequence. Foreshocks are earthquakes that precede a much larger main event. They look identical to ordinary swarms in every measurable way. Same depths, same wave patterns, same clustering behavior. The only difference is what comes after them, and that difference only becomes visible once the main event has already begun. Scientists cannot tell the 2 apart in real time. A seismologist watching a cluster develop on their monitor has no reliable way to know, in that moment, whether they are watching harmless stress release or the opening act of a catastrophe. This is one of the most frustrating gaps in modern earthquake science, and it is the exact gap that the 2026 swarm sat inside. After a major earthquake strikes, scientists can go back and reclassify the earlier activity as foreshocks. They can map how the swarm tracked toward the eventual rupture point. They can see the pattern clearly in hindsight. Going forward in real time, the tools available do not yet bridge that gap. The factors that push a swarm toward higher concern are specific: Location matters most. A swarm near a known locked fault interface carries more weight than a swarm in a geologically quieter area. Depth matters next. Shallow quakes along the locked zone suggest stress is concentrating right at the surface where ruptures begin. Frequency matters too. A swarm that accelerates, with quakes arriving faster and closer together, sometimes signals that a system is approaching a breaking point. The 2026 cluster checked 2 of those 3 boxes. It sat near a major locked interface. Its earthquakes were shallow. The frequency had not yet shown the kind of rapid acceleration that would push the situation into a higher alert category. But the cluster had also not stopped. It kept producing small quakes for days after the initial 5.7. Each new event updated the analysis. For the public, this uncertainty felt invisible. No official warning had been issued. Life on the West Coast continued unchanged. But inside monitoring networks, the situation was being tracked with the kind of focus that only surfaces when a combination of location, depth, and timing puts a swarm into a rare category. The last time a comparable cluster appeared near this tectonic boundary, scientists later identified what it preceded. The geological record showed it clearly. The swarm itself had been ordinary. What followed had not been. And somewhere off the Oregon coast, in a place most people had never heard of, a different fault system had already demonstrated exactly what a large offshore swarm could look like without producing any disaster at all. In December of 2021, the ocean floor off the coast of Oregon produced one of the most intense earthquake swarms ever recorded in that region. Over the course of just 48 hours, nearly 100 earthquakes struck a stretch of underwater fault called the Blanco Fracture Zone. They arrived in rapid succession, sometimes multiple quakes within the same hour. Seismometers up and down the west coast registered the activity continuously. On paper, the numbers looked alarming. Nothing bad happened. No tsunami formed. No coastal damage occurred. Emergency systems monitored the swarm and issued no warnings. By the time the cluster ended, seismologists had already classified it as a routine, if unusually energetic, episode of crustal movement. The 2021 swarm became a useful reference point, a recent example of how a large, prolonged offshore cluster could unfold at full intensity without producing a catastrophic outcome. The reason came down to a single mechanical detail. The earthquakes at the Blanco Fracture Zone involved horizontal slip. The 2 sides of the fault moved sideways relative to each other, like 2 trains passing on parallel tracks. Geologists call this strike-slip motion. It produces powerful shaking. It can cause significant damage near populated areas. What it does not do, in an offshore setting, is generate a tsunami. A tsunami requires vertical displacement of the water column. Something on the seafloor has to push upward or drop downward sharply enough to displace an enormous volume of water all at once. Strike-slip faults move sideways. The seafloor shifts horizontally, but does not lunge upward or collapse downward in the way that creates the initial surge of a tsunami wave. The Blanco Fracture Zone runs east to west across the ocean floor, cutting through the seafloor like a long scar. It is a transform fault, meaning the plates on either side of it slide past each other rather than colliding or pulling apart. The energy it releases, even in a swarm of nearly 100 quakes, escapes sideways through the crust and dissipates without sending a wall of water toward shore. Understanding this distinction took the 2021 event from frightening to instructive. Scientists used it to sharpen the criteria for when an offshore cluster deserves a public warning and when it represents a dramatic but ultimately harmless mechanical event. The Cascadia subduction zone operates on completely different mechanics. Subduction faults move vertically. When the locked interface finally ruptures, one plate lunges upward while the other drops. The ocean floor above the rupture rises suddenly. The water sitting on top of it has nowhere to go except outward in every direction. That outward pulse, amplified and focused by the geometry of the coastline, becomes a tsunami. The scale of that difference matters. One fault type produces a dramatic seismic event with no wave. The other produces both the earthquake and the wave, and it gives coastal communities a window of time measured in minutes to reach high ground. The 2021 swarm gave seismologists a clear example of a harmless cluster. The 2026 swarm near the Gorda Plate was occurring on a different type of fault structure entirely. The mechanics were different, the location was different, and the fault sitting just beneath the cluster had a history that made the two events very difficult to compare in any reassuring way. That history stretched back over 300 years, and its most dramatic moment was recorded not by any instrument, but by the people who felt the wave on the other side of the ocean. One number separates a terrifying earthquake from a civilization-altering one. That number is 0. Specifically, the direction of movement along a fault. A fault that moves horizontally produces one kind of disaster. A fault that moves vertically produces something in a completely different category. The distinction sounds technical. The consequences are anything but. When a fault ruptures horizontally, the ground on either side of it shears sideways. Buildings collapse, roads crack open, bridges fail. The destruction can be severe, especially near the epicenter, but the energy stays mostly within the land and the rock. It spreads outward through the crust and diminishes as it travels. The ocean above an offshore horizontal fault ripples but does not surge. Vertical rupture is different in kind, not just degree. When one plate suddenly lurches upward while the other drops, the movement transfers directly into the water column above it. Imagine the entire ocean floor along a 600-mile fault snapping upward by 20 or 30 feet in a matter of seconds. Every cubic foot of water sitting above that zone gets displaced simultaneously. The ocean surface heaves. The water has to go somewhere. It goes outward in every direction, as a wave that carries the full energy of the rupture. Deep water compresses a tsunami into a fast, flat ripple. In deep ocean, a tsunami can travel at the speed of a commercial airplane, roughly 500 miles per hour, while barely rising above the normal wave height. A boat at sea might not even notice it passing underneath. The wave only becomes catastrophic when it reaches shallow water near shore. As the depth decreases, the wave slows down, but the energy it carries has not gone anywhere. That energy gets converted into height. The wave stacks up. It grows. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, the geometry of the seafloor funnels this energy directly toward land. Certain bays and inlets act like amplifiers. A wave that measured 30 feet in open water can stack to 60 or 80 feet by the time it reaches a specific inlet shape. Modeling of a full Cascadia rupture has produced projected tsunami heights of 100 feet in some of the most exposed coastal locations. 100 feet is taller than a 9-story building. The Gorda Plate, locked beneath the ocean and feeding stress into the Cascadia subduction zone, sits above a vertical slip fault. If that interface ruptures, the displacement would be upward. The water above it would move. The coast would receive the wave. The difference in fault mechanics also changes how much warning exists. A strike-slip quake offshore shakes the coast first and generates no wave, giving people time to assess damage before realizing they are safe from flooding. A subduction rupture produces shaking and launches the wave simultaneously. The shaking itself is the warning signal. By the time the ground stops moving, the clock for coastal evacuation has already been running for several minutes. That evacuation window from the moment the shaking stops to the moment the first wave arrives is roughly 15 to 20 minutes for the closest coastal communities. Some are shorter. Scientists have mapped those windows for every town along the Pacific Northwest coast. The maps exist. The question is how many people know to use them. What drives all of this, the shaking, the wave, the collapse, the flooding, is the fact that the Cascadia Fault has been locked for over 3 centuries, building pressure with every passing year. Understanding how a locked fault actually works changes how alarming that 300-year number truly is. The word locked does not mean still. Beneath the Pacific Northwest, The Cascadia subduction zone is locked. The Gorda Plate is pressing eastward and downward with enormous force. The North American Plate is sitting on top of it. The two surfaces are in contact across a zone stretching hundreds of miles. They are gripping each other with friction so powerful that from the surface everything looks quiet. No obvious movement, no visible strain, just land, ocean, and the illusion of stability. Below that surface, something very different is happening. The Gorda Plate continues moving. It has no choice. The forces driving it come from deep inside the Earth, from the convection of molten rock in the mantle far below the locked zone. Those forces do not stop because the surface is locked. They keep pushing. And because the locked zone cannot slide freely, all of that accumulated movement gets converted into stored elastic energy. Geologists describe this as elastic strain. The crust around a locked fault stretches slightly as the plates try to move past each other, and cannot. The deformation is real but too small to see with the naked eye. Scientists measure it using networks of GPS sensors placed across the Pacific Northwest. Over years and decades, those sensors record tiny, consistent movements of the land, millimeter by millimeter, as the crust above the locked zone gets dragged slowly eastward by the plate below it. This stretching cannot continue indefinitely. Every material has a breaking point. The crust above the Cascadia subduction zone is accumulating deformation year after year. Each year the plate keeps moving while the surface stays locked. The system loads a little more. Scientists sometimes compare this to pulling back a bowstring. The longer you hold it, the more energy you store. The moment you release it, every bit of that stored energy converts instantly into motion. For a fault, that releases the earthquake. The locked surfaces suddenly slip. All of the accumulated deformation releases in seconds to minutes. The crust snaps back toward where it would have been had the plates been moving freely all along. In a large subduction earthquake, that snapback can be dramatic. GPS sensors after a major rupture show the land moving by feet, sometimes by tens of feet, in a matter of minutes. The Cascadia subduction zone has been locked and loading for over 300 years. The GPS network across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California measures the strain accumulation. The numbers are not mysterious. The fault is loading. The only open question is when the bowstring lets go. There is one more layer to this that makes the stored energy harder to fully comprehend. A subduction zone locks not just in one place, but across a vast area. The Cascadia subduction zone is estimated to be locked across a zone that could be 30 to 50 miles wide in some sections, stretching along the full 600-mile length of the fault. The total volume of rock under strain is almost too large to picture. If all of that releases at once, the energy output would dwarf almost every historical earthquake on record. Scientists have modeled what that release looks like. The models are not speculative exercises. They are based on measurements, historical records, and physical laws. And every version of those models points to the same outcome for the 600-mile length of coast directly above the fault. That fault has a name, and its full history, going back thousands of years, is written into the landscape in a way anyone can see with their own eyes, if they know where to look. Draw a line on a map starting in Northern California, just above Cape Mendocino. Pull that line north through the entire Oregon coast. Keep going through western Washington, past the Olympic Peninsula, and across the border into British Columbia, all the way to the edge of Vancouver Island. That line is roughly 600 miles long. Every inch of it sits directly above the Cascadia subduction zone. The Cascadia fault is enormous by any standard. 600 miles of locked fault interface places it among the largest subduction zones on Earth. For comparison, the entire length of California's San Andreas Fault is about 800 miles, but the San Andreas is a strike-slip fault. It moves horizontally. Cascadia moves vertically. In terms of earthquake and tsunami potential, the two faults are in different categories. The full 600-mile length matters because of how earthquakes scale with fault area. A larger rupture area means more rocks slipping at once. More rocks slipping at once means more energy released. Earthquake magnitude is tied directly to the area of the fault that ruptures. A fault segment 30 miles long might produce a magnitude 6 earthquake. A fault segment 600 miles long, rupturing all at once, produces a magnitude 9. A magnitude 9 earthquake releases roughly 30 times more energy than a magnitude 8. A magnitude 8 releases roughly 30 times more than a magnitude 7. The scale is exponential, not linear. Most people imagine the difference between a 6 and a 9 as being about 3 units larger. The actual energy difference between those two numbers is closer to 30,000 times. If the entire Cascadia subduction zone ruptures at once, the resulting earthquake would be among the most powerful ever recorded in human history. Shaking would be felt from northern California to British Columbia. Infrastructure across 3 states and a Canadian province would experience simultaneous stress. The width of the locked zone adds another dimension. Seismologists estimate the Cascadia interface locks tightly in its shallowest section, from the coastline extending roughly 60 to 80 miles offshore. The locked zone in some parts of the fault sits directly beneath the ocean floor, just miles off the Pacific coast. When that zone ruptures, the sea floor above it lunges upward, the water column gets displaced, the tsunami launches. Every coastal community from Crescent City in California to Victoria in British Columbia sits in the projected impact zone of a full Cascadia rupture. Scientists have spent years modeling the wave heights, the arrival times, and the inundation zones for each major coastal town. Those models exist in public databases. Emergency managers use them to design evacuation routes and build warning protocols. All of those models have one common anchor: a historical event that already demonstrated exactly what a full-margin Cascadia rupture produces. An event so powerful its evidence showed up on the other side of the Pacific, in a country with no knowledge of what had just happened on the American coast. The date was fixed, the location was fixed, and the physical evidence it left behind was so durable that 3 centuries later people could walk to the Oregon coast and see it with their own eyes. Walk to the right stretch of Oregon coastline at low tide, and you will see something that should not be there. Dozens of dark wooden stumps rise from the tidal mud. They stand in rows, preserved by the cold, low-oxygen water that has surrounded them for over 3 centuries. They are the remnants of a spruce forest that once grew on dry land. The land they stood on no longer exists at its original elevation. During a single event, in a matter of minutes, the ground dropped and the ocean claimed what used to be forest floor. The trees drowned where they stood. They never fell. They simply stopped living as the salt water rose around their roots. Scientists call these formations ghost forests. They appear at several sites along the Oregon and Washington coastlines. Each one marks the location of a former forest that was yanked below the tidal zone during a subduction earthquake. The evidence they carry is precise. Scientists can core the preserved wood and measure the year the tree died using ring patterns. They can also sample the sediment layers surrounding the stumps and find the tsunami deposit, a thin layer of ocean sand sitting directly above the layer of soil where the trees once grew. Ghost forests are geological timestamps. They record not just that an earthquake happened, but when, how large the land drop was, and how far the subsequent tsunami wave reached inland. Each site gives scientists a data point to cross-reference against other evidence from the same event. In the 1980s and 90s, geologist Brian Atwater from the United States Geological Survey spent years walking coastal marshes in Washington and Oregon, digging into the ground, and piecing together the story layer by layer. What he found matched across multiple sites separated by hundreds of miles: the same sudden land subsidence, the same abrupt die-off of forest, all pointing to a single simultaneous event across the entire fault. The ghost forests confirmed something seismologists had debated for years. The Cascadia subduction zone was capable of rupturing along its entire 600-mile length in a single earthquake. Some scientists had argued that the fault might only rupture in shorter segments, producing more moderate earthquakes more frequently. The ghost forest evidence, consistent from Northern California to Washington, showed that the fault had ruptured all at once. One finding deepened the picture further. Buried beneath some of the ghost forest sediment, researchers found evidence of older events. The same pattern repeated: sudden land drop, tsunami deposit, dead forest, then slow recovery over centuries, and then the pattern again. Multiple cycles stretching back thousands of years. Cascadia had done this before, multiple times, and each time it reset the coast. The physical evidence made the threat real in a way that sensor data alone could not. These were trees. They grew in soil. People once walked past them, maybe harvested them, built with the wood around them. And in a single night, without any warning, the ground beneath them dropped, the ocean moved in, and what had been dry land became seafloor. The night that caused all of it was documented. The date was January 26th, 1700, and the proof of it came not from American shores, but from a record kept 7,000 miles away by people who had no idea what they were measuring. The samurai who recorded it had no name for what it was. On the evening of January 27th, 1700, observers along the Japanese coast watched a wave arrive from the open ocean, with no warning and no preceding earthquake on their soil. It struck the Sanriku coast of Japan with enough force to flood rice paddies, damage homes, and record itself in the official logs of multiple coastal domains. The samurai and record keepers of the time documented the wave's arrival with careful detail. They noted the height, the time, the damage. They had no explanation for where it came from. The wave had traveled approximately 7,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. It had taken roughly 9 to 10 hours to cross that distance. Working backward from the arrival time recorded in Japan, scientists in the 1990s calculated exactly when the wave must have been generated on the American side of the Pacific. The calculation pointed to the evening of January 26, 1700, Pacific time. That calculation gave scientists something extraordinary: an exact date and approximate time for the last full rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone. An earthquake that struck before any seismometer existed, before any modern scientific instrument could record it, was pinned to a specific night because of a Japanese coastal record kept by people who experienced the wave and had no idea it had come from North America. The earthquake that launched that wave carried an estimated magnitude of 9.0. Scientists derived that number by combining the Japanese wave height data with the coastal subsidence measurements from ghost forests, up and down the American coast. The land drop recorded in the organic layers, cross-referenced with tsunami modeling, constrained the rupture size. A smaller earthquake could not have produced a wave that reached Japan at the observed height. A larger one would have left a different pattern in the sediment record. 9.0 placed the 1700 Cascadia earthquake among the most powerful ruptures in recorded geological history. For comparison, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which destroyed the city and is still the benchmark for West Coast seismic disasters in American memory, measured an estimated magnitude of 7.9. The energy difference between 7.9 and 9.0 is staggering. The 1700 Cascadia event released approximately 500 times more energy than the earthquake that leveled San Francisco. The Japanese records provided the time, the ghost forests provided the location and the scale of land collapse. Sediment cores from coastal marshes provided the tsunami inundation extent. Together, these three independent lines of evidence built a picture of the 1700 event that is now among the most precisely documented prehistoric earthquakes on Earth. And somewhere in that documentation was a detail that still disturbs scientists. The full fault had ruptured all at once. Every inch of the 600-mile locked interface had let go simultaneously. The resulting shaking had lasted for an estimated 5 full minutes. 5 minutes of continuous ground motion before the wave ever arrived. No seismometer existed in 1700. No satellite network tracked the ground's movement. No sensor measured the ocean floor displacement. The earthquake that struck the Cascadia subduction zone that January night left no digital record, no instrument data, no recorded waveform. Scientists reconstructed it anyway, and they did it with a precision that rivals some modern earthquake analyses. The process started with the Japanese tsunami logs. Researchers in Japan had maintained careful records of coastal flooding events for centuries. When scientists began searching archives in the 1990s, they found multiple independent accounts from different domains along the Sanriku coast, describing the same orphan tsunami. An orphan tsunami is a wave that arrives without any locally felt earthquake preceding it, meaning the source was too far away for the shaking to reach the observers before the wave did. The wave heights recorded in those logs allowed scientists to run backward calculations. Tsunami propagation models, built on the physics of how waves travel through deep and shallow water, could take the observed height at a known location and estimate the original displacement at the source. By matching the Japanese wave data to the geographical constraints of the Pacific Ocean, the models pointed consistently to the Cascadia subduction zone as the origin. The land subsidence data from the Pacific Northwest added the second layer of confirmation. Coastal marshes up and down the Oregon and Washington coast preserved abrupt transitions in their sediment layers. Below a certain depth, the pollen and plant material in the sediment reflected upland forest species. Then, immediately above that layer, saltwater species appeared and the upland plants vanished. The transition happened all at once, over a boundary thin enough to measure in centimeters. That kind of abrupt transition happens only one way. The land drops suddenly, saltwater floods in, and the terrestrial ecosystem dies instantly. A gradual sea level rise would leave a gradual transition in the sediment. The sharp boundary recorded across multiple sites simultaneously pointed to a single rapid event. The thickness of the tsunami sand deposit sitting on top of that boundary helped constrain both the wave height and the direction it came from. Dendrochronology, the science of reading tree rings, provided the third line of evidence. Scientists cored the ghost forest stumps and counted the rings to determine the last year the tree had grown normally. Several stumps showed their outermost ring was incomplete, meaning the tree died before finishing its growth season for the year 1700. That narrowed the earthquake's timing to the period between the last growing season of 1699 and the early months of 1700, precisely matching the Japanese wave arrival calculations. 3 entirely independent forms of evidence, one from Japan, one from coastal sediment, and one from dead trees, each arrived at the same date, the same location, and the same approximate magnitude. Scientists consider the reconstruction of the 1700 Cascadia earthquake one of the most successful forensic geology projects ever completed. What that reconstruction revealed was more than a historical data point. It revealed a template. The 1700 event showed what a full Cascadia rupture produces: the shaking pattern, the subsidence extent, the tsunami reach, the duration of ground motion. Every detail of that event gives scientists a model for what the next one will look like. And one detail of that model, confirmed by the physical evidence across multiple sites, was the duration of the shaking itself: 5 minutes of continuous ground motion across hundreds of miles. That kind of shaking does things to infrastructure that a 30-second earthquake simply cannot. Most people have never felt an earthquake longer than a few seconds. A 1-second jolt rattles dishes and grabs your attention. A 5-second tremor feels alarming, long enough to make you question whether to move. A 30-second earthquake is terrifying. It feels endless. It is enough to crack walls, knock objects off shelves, and cause structural damage to older buildings. 5 minutes of continuous shaking is in a different category entirely. The 1700 Cascadia earthquake is estimated to have shaken the Pacific Northwest for approximately 300 seconds. That estimate comes from the physics of a fault rupturing across 600 miles of locked interface. The rupture does not happen everywhere at once. It starts at one point and tears along the fault like a zipper, propagating at roughly 2 miles per second. At that speed, traveling 600 miles takes approximately 5 minutes from the first rupture to the last. During that 5 minutes, everything on the surface experiences sustained, violent ground motion. Buildings that might survive a short, sharp shock can fail completely under prolonged shaking. The reason is fatigue. Structures are designed to handle forces in specific directions for limited durations. Prolonged shaking cycles the material back and forth repeatedly. Wood joints loosen. Concrete develops progressive cracks. Steel connections experience repeated stress that exceeds what any single sharp blow would cause. Bridges are particularly vulnerable. The West Coast has hundreds of aging highway bridges that engineers have identified as seismically deficient. A 30-second earthquake might leave many of them standing with damage. 5 minutes of shaking would push a large number past the point of failure. When the ground stops moving, the routes that emergency vehicles need to reach survivors would be severed in multiple places simultaneously. Underground infrastructure fails in a different way. Water mains, gas lines, and sewer pipes run through soil that liquefies during prolonged shaking. Liquefaction happens when saturated ground shakes long enough that the water between soil particles temporarily takes on the properties of a liquid. Solid ground behaves like wet sand. Buildings sink. Pipes snap. The ground surface can develop waves and depressions that make roads impassable, even where no bridge has collapsed. The Pacific Northwest coastline has extensive areas of liquefiable soil, particularly in river deltas, filled land near ports, and coastal lowlands. Portland, Seattle, and several smaller coastal cities have identified liquefaction hazard zones within their boundaries. A 5-minute earthquake does not just damage buildings in those zones, it fundamentally alters the physical surface of the ground they sit on. After the shaking stops, the next threat arrives. The clock for coastal evacuation begins the moment the first tremor is felt. By the time 5 minutes of shaking has ended, that evacuation window is already mostly consumed. The people closest to the coast have perhaps 10 to 15 minutes remaining to reach high ground before the first wave arrives. Those 10 to 15 minutes assume a clean start. After 5 minutes of sustained shaking, roads are damaged, cars may be buried under debris, and many people will be disoriented or injured. The combination of prolonged shaking and a compressed evacuation window is the specific scenario that emergency planners describe as the most difficult to manage in any Pacific Northwest catastrophe. And the shaking itself is only the first of 3 separate catastrophic events that strike in sequence. The second one changes the physical landscape permanently. The shaking stops. For a moment, everything is quiet. The ground has stopped moving. The immediate instinct is relief. The earthquake is over. The worst is behind you. It is not, because in the same moment the fault released, something happened to the land beneath your feet that you cannot see or feel as it occurs. The coastal ground just dropped, and it is never coming back up. Here is the mechanism. Before the earthquake, the land along the Pacific Northwest coast was being pulled upward. The locked Cascadia Fault was dragging the overlying crust eastward and slightly upward as the plates strained against each other. That uplift was gradual, invisible, and constant across decades. It had kept the coastline elevated slightly above where it would naturally sit. When the fault ruptures, that elastic strain releases instantly. The crust is no longer being held in its stretched position, it snaps back. The land that had been elevated drops to its natural resting position. The drop happens in seconds. Scientific models, based on the strain measurements recorded by GPS networks and the land subsidence documented in the ghost forests, project that the coastal land could drop by as much as 6.5 feet during a major Cascadia rupture. 6.5 feet does not sound catastrophic until you apply it to a specific landscape. Take a coastal town sitting 2 to 4 feet above current sea level. After the earthquake, that town sits 2 to 3 feet below sea level, permanently. The ocean does not need a tsunami to flood it. The ground subsidence alone puts it underwater. Harbors change shape. River mouths shift. Drainage systems that relied on gravity to carry water toward the ocean now slope the wrong direction. Roads that sat above the floodplain are now at or below the high tide line. The physical geography of the coastline rewrites itself in the seconds it takes for the elastic strain to release. Ghost forest evidence from the 1700 earthquake documents subsidence of roughly 3 to 5 feet across multiple sites in Oregon and Washington. The land dropped, the tidal zone advanced, and forests that had stood on dry ground became permanent tidal wetlands. 3 centuries later, the stumps are still there, still below the high tide line, still marking exactly where the coast used to be. Modern coastal communities sit on that same landscape. Astoria, Oregon has portions of its waterfront district that seismic models project would drop into the tidal zone during a major rupture. Seaside, Oregon, which sits at a low elevation near the mouth of a river, faces projected subsidence that would put significant portions of the town at or below sea level before the tsunami even arrives. The subsidence means that even communities positioned outside the highest tsunami inundation zones face a permanent change in their relationship with the ocean. Land that drains, roads that function, and drainage systems that work today would not work in the same way after a major rupture. Recovery from that kind of permanent geographical change takes years of infrastructure rebuilding, not weeks. The subsidence resets the playing field. The tsunami then arrives to hit a coastline that has already changed, and the wave that strikes that altered coast is unlike anything in living American memory. A magnitude 9 earthquake lasts 5 minutes. The ground drops 6.5 feet. The ocean advances, and then it stays. The shift in coastline that follows a major Cascadia rupture is permanent on any human timescale. Geological processes do operate slowly and can eventually rebuild subsided coastlines over hundreds to thousands of years. But in the days, weeks, and months after the earthquake, the communities that occupied the newly submerged land are simply gone from the map. The ground they sat on is now intertidal zone. Tidal mudflats are what remain when land drops below the reach of normal tidal action. Twice a day, water flows over them. Twice a day, it retreats. No structure survives that cycle for long. Salt water corrodes foundations. Repeated flooding saturates everything organic. Roads dissolve into mud. Buildings that were not destroyed by the earthquake itself are destroyed by the sustained tidal action over the following weeks. The communities most exposed to this outcome sit in the lowest lying coastal zones of Oregon and Washington. Several towns along the Oregon coast sit at elevations of less than 10 feet above sea level, and some sections of those towns are even lower. The projection of 6.5 feet of subsidence puts those low sections at or below the tidal range. Even moderate post-subsidence tidal flooding, without any tsunami involvement, recovery from subsidence is not as straightforward as rebuilding damaged buildings. You cannot rebuild on land that is now below the ocean. Either the land gets raised artificially, an expensive and slow civil engineering process, or the community relocates. Both options require time measured in years and resources measured in billions of dollars. Following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, entire towns sat in mud and salt water for months, while emergency planners debated whether to raise the ground or relocate the population. Japan had the resources, the engineering expertise, and the government coordination to eventually address the problem. The scale of the challenge was enormous, even for one of the most prepared nations on Earth. The Pacific Northwest would face the same question across multiple communities simultaneously, immediately after the largest natural disaster in American history, with transportation networks severed by the earthquake and tsunami damage. Emergency planners have modeled this scenario, The models show that the communities facing permanent subsidence would also be among the hardest to reach in the immediate aftermath, because the roads connecting them to inland areas pass through the same low-elevation coastal zones that the subsidence affects. The routes for moving people out and supplies in would be compromised by the same geological shift that destroyed the town. The subsidence is the quiet catastrophe inside the larger one. It gets less attention than the tsunami because it is slower and less visually dramatic. But its effects last far longer. The tsunami arrives, strikes, and retreats. The land drop is permanent. 3 centuries after 1700, the ghost forests are still below the tide. The land never recovered, and the wave that follows the subsidence is coming toward a coastline that is already lower than it was 30 minutes before. The calculation of how far the tsunami reaches inland changes when the land it is flooding has already dropped. The earthquake ends. The ground has dropped, and somewhere offshore, the ocean floor has lurched upward across 600 miles of fault. The water above it has no choice but to move. In the deep ocean, the wave spreads outward from the rupture zone in every direction. It travels at roughly 500 miles per hour in water several miles deep. At that speed, in deep water, it is nearly invisible. A ship at sea would feel a gentle rise and fall, barely distinguishable from ordinary wave action. No alarm, no wall of water, just a pulse moving through the ocean at the speed of a jetliner. That pulse is carrying an enormous amount of energy. The height of the wave in deep water might measure only a few feet, but the wavelength, the distance from one crest to the next, can stretch for hundreds of miles. The entire volume of water between those two crests, hundreds of miles wide and miles deep, is all moving together in the same direction. The energy content of that moving volume is almost incomprehensible. As the wave approaches the coast, the ocean floor rises. The wave slows down because friction with the shallower seafloor acts as a brake, but the energy does not decrease. It has to go somewhere. The wave compresses, the length shrinks, the height grows. The same energy that was spread across hundreds of miles of wavelength gets concentrated into a much shorter, much taller wall of water. Modeling of a full Cascadia rupture places the first wave arrival at the nearest Oregon coastal communities between 15 and 30 minutes after the shaking stops. Some of the most exposed locations, like small coastal towns near the base of steep headlands where the seafloor rises sharply, could receive the first wave in as little as 10 minutes. 10 minutes is not much time. After 5 minutes of violent shaking, a 10-minute window to reach high ground assumes that roads are passable, that people are mobile, and that they begin moving the moment the ground stops shaking. In reality, the post-earthquake environment complicates all three of those assumptions. Emergency managers refer to the shaking itself as the natural warning system. No siren, no alert system, and no phone notification can reach people faster than feeling the ground move beneath them. The protocol is straightforward. If you feel strong, prolonged shaking near the coast, move inland and upward immediately. Do not wait for an official warning. Do not stop to collect belongings. Move. That protocol depends on people knowing it exists. Studies of public preparedness in coastal Oregon and Washington have shown significant variation in awareness levels between different communities. Towns with active preparedness programs have residents who know what to do. Towns without them do not. The wave that arrives after those 10 to 30 minutes is not the dramatic vertical wall of water that appears in disaster movies. It arrives as a rapidly advancing surge, a rapid rise in water level that moves inland faster than a person can run. It carries debris, vehicles, and structural material from everything it passed over on the way in. That debris turns the moving water into a destructive force that overwhelms whatever it contacts. And the first wave is followed by more. Tsunamis arrive in a series. The second and third waves are often larger than the first. The full series can continue for several hours. High ground is the only survivable position, and the height needed is not 10 feet. For the most exposed coastal locations, the models project wave heights that reach toward 100 feet. 100 feet of water does not arrive as a wall. People imagine a tsunami as a vertical cliff of blue ocean crashing down on a beach. That image comes from disaster films and animation. The physics of real tsunamis are different, and in some ways more terrifying because the destruction is slower, wider, and more complete. A 100-foot tsunami surge means the ocean surface rises 100 feet above its normal level. Think of a 10-story building. The water reaches the top of that building. Every structure below that elevation is submerged, broken apart by the flow, or swept inland. The flow arrives quickly, often faster than a sprint, but the rise takes minutes, not seconds. Long enough for people at lower elevations to see the water coming and understand they cannot outrun it. The comparisons that make this height concrete are useful. The Statue of Liberty from base to torch stands over 300 feet tall. The wave would cover the statue up to the level of her waist. The average American home stands about 30 feet from ground to rooftop. A 100-foot surge puts the average home completely underwater with 70 feet to spare. An 8-story apartment building disappears beneath the surface. 100-foot projections apply to specific high-exposure locations along the Pacific Northwest coast, places where bay geometry, seafloor topography, and coastline shape combine to amplify the incoming surge. These are the most dangerous locations, the coastal inlets and protected bays that channel the wave's energy rather than dispersing it. In more open coastal areas, wave heights in the 40 to 60-foot range are projected, which remains catastrophic but does not reach the extreme amplified heights of the worst-case inlets. The variation in wave height across the coast is significant and depends heavily on local geography. What 100 feet of moving water carries is as destructive as the height itself. Structures torn from their foundations become projectiles. Vehicles, fuel tanks, storage containers, industrial equipment, and the remains of buildings all become part of the flow. The debris load multiplies the force of the water against whatever it contacts next. A wave carrying that debris is not pushing against a building, it is delivering a sustained battering of material at high velocity. After the wave retreats, it carries that debris back with it into the ocean. This backwash is also dangerous. People who survive the initial surge and attempt to move towards safety on foot face the outgoing current carrying the same debris field that came in. The retreat can last minutes and moves with significant force. For the communities sitting within the 100-foot inundation zones, survivability depends entirely on reaching high ground before the wave arrives. Everything at lower elevation faces complete inundation. The geological record from the 1700 event confirmed this. Scientists found tsunami deposits miles inland in some coastal valleys, evidence of how far the surge penetrated before losing enough energy to stop. Ancient evidence of that wave was found in an unexpected place, far below the surface, in layers of mud that had sat undisturbed for centuries. Researchers discovered something that proved the Pacific Northwest coast had been through this cycle many times before, long before any written history existed on this continent. The evidence was buried under several feet of sediment, far below the current ground surface. Researchers excavating coastal sites in the Pacific Northwest began finding anomalies in the soil layers. Beneath undisturbed mud and sand that carried clear tsunami signatures, they found charcoal. Preserved charcoal, arranged in patterns that indicated human use. Ancient fire pits, the remnants of hearths where people had gathered, cooked, and lived, buried beneath layers of material deposited by prehistoric tsunami floods. The fire pits confirmed something the geological record alone could suggest, but not prove. People lived on this coast during previous Cascadia earthquakes. They occupied the ground that the ocean then claimed. The charcoal preserved their presence at those sites, and the sediment layers above the charcoal recorded what happened after they were there. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal placed some of the fire pits at ages spanning several thousand years. In multiple locations, researchers found the same pattern repeated at different depths: a layer of human habitation, then an abrupt sediment shift indicating flooding, then recovery, then habitation again, then another flood deposit. The cycle repeated across thousands of years, each repetition documenting another Cascadia rupture event. This evidence served two purposes. First, it extended the earthquake record back far beyond the 1700 event, confirming that Cascadia had ruptured repeatedly over its geological lifetime, not just once in recorded history. Second, it carried something more unsettling. The people living at those sites had no recorded history of the previous event. Each generation occupied the coast without direct inherited memory of the catastrophe that had buried the previous inhabitants' fire pits below them. Scientists counting the buried flood layers in the most well-studied Pacific Northwest coastal sites have identified somewhere between 19 and 20 full-margin ruptures over the past 10,000 years. That count gives the fault a recurrence interval of roughly 450 to 500 years between events. Some intervals were shorter, some were longer, but the average held remarkably consistent across 10 millennia. Sitting at over 325 years since the last event, the Cascadia Fault is deep inside that historical recurrence window. Scientists are careful to clarify that faults do not operate on exact schedules. The next rupture could occur tomorrow or could still be a century away. The window does not predict the moment, it establishes the probability zone. What the ancient fire pits added to this probability conversation was a human dimension. The geological cycles were real. They had happened repeatedly, and each time the evidence suggested communities living on the coast had no warning system, no evacuation protocol, and no institutional memory of what the prolonged shaking meant. Modern coastal communities along the Pacific Northwest have all three of those things, at least in principle. The warning signs are documented, the evacuation routes exist on maps. The institutional knowledge of what a full Cascadia rupture produces comes from the geological record, from the ghost forests, from the Japanese tsunami logs, from the ancient fire pits, and from the sediment cores pulled from the ocean floor itself. Those sediment cores deserve their own story. The technology used to extract them, and what scientists read in the layers of mud they contain, gave the earthquake research community some of its most precise data about timing, frequency, and magnitude of past Cascadia events, and the method itself is strange enough to stop you mid-sentence when you first hear it described. The ship holds its position above the open ocean, miles from shore. A hollow steel tube hangs from a cable over the side of the vessel. The tube is roughly the diameter of a soda can, but it is 60 feet long. Scientists lower it until it touches the seafloor. Then they drive it downward into the mud using gravity and a heavy weight attached to the top. The tube punches through the sediment and captures a column of material that has been sitting undisturbed on the ocean floor for thousands of years. They call it a sediment core. When they pull it back up and split it open lengthwise in the laboratory, what they see inside is a layered record of every major geological event that dropped material onto that section of seafloor. Ordinary sediment accumulates slowly, in thin, even layers of fine particles. A major event, a landslide, a volcanic eruption, or a massive earthquake triggering an underwater avalanche deposits a thick, coarse layer all at once. Those event layers stand out clearly from the background sediment, like dark lines in a striped shirt. Each thick layer gets sampled. Scientists extract organic material from just below and just above the event deposit, and radiocarbon date it. The dates bracket the event. The thickness and grain size of the deposit constrain the energy of whatever caused it. By comparing cores from multiple sites along the sea floor, scientists can trace a single event layer across hundreds of miles of ocean bottom, confirming it came from one source rather than a series of local disturbances. For the Cascadia subduction zone, sediment cores pulled from the deep sea fans off the Oregon and Washington coast have been particularly revealing. When the fault ruptures, the shaking triggers massive underwater avalanches called turbidity currents. These currents carry sediment down the continental slope at high speed, depositing thick sandy layers called turbidites on the deep ocean floor. Each turbidite layer represents a major seismic event. Scientists count them to get an earthquake timeline going back thousands of years. A team led by geologist Chris Goldfinger spent years systematically coring the seafloor off the Pacific Northwest coast and comparing the turbidite records across dozens of sites. The results produced the most detailed and extended earthquake record available for the Cascadia Fault. The cores confirmed the roughly 450 to 500 year occurrence pattern. They also showed that some past ruptures had been even larger than the 1700 event. Certain turbidite layers were thicker than others. More material deposited means more energy released. The cores suggested that a subset of past Cascadia earthquakes had produced ruptures covering not just the 600-mile full fault length, but possibly extending even further, with larger displacement than the already enormous 1700 event. Those larger ruptures, which the research team estimated at potentially magnitude 9.2 or higher, appear in the record at longer intervals between the standard full margin events. The sediment cores do not just document what happened, they document what the range of possible outcomes actually looks like. The next Cascadia rupture could match 1700. It could also exceed it. And somewhere beneath the monitored ocean floor, something else was happening that produced no turbidite layer, no ghost forest, no tsunami, and no shaking that any instrument could detect. A different kind of fault movement, invisible to almost every sensor, that scientists only learned about in the last few decades. There is a type of earthquake that produces no shaking. The fault moves, the plates shift, stress transfers from one section of the crust to another. The entire sequence that normally produces violent ground motion plays out, but at a speed so slow that the human body cannot detect it, and most seismometers register only a faint whisper of the event. These are called slow slip earthquakes, or episodic tremor and slip events, and they occur beneath the Pacific Northwest on a regular cycle. Every 12 to 15 months, the deep portion of the Cascadia subduction zone slips silently. The movement happens at depths of around 20 to 30 miles below the surface, below the locked zone where the catastrophic earthquake potential sits. The slip occurs over a period of weeks, sometimes months, with the fault moving fractions of an inch per day rather than the many feet per second that characterizes a destructive rupture. GPS sensors across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia detect slow slip events by tracking the direction the land surface moves. During a slow slip episode, the GPS stations along the coast shift slightly toward the west, the opposite direction from how the locked shallow zone is pulling them. The movement is tiny, measured in millimeters, but the GPS networks are precise enough to catch it clearly. Scientists discovered slow slip events in the Pacific Northwest in the early 2000s. Before high-precision GPS networks existed, the phenomenon was essentially invisible. Once the networks went in, the regular cycle became apparent almost immediately. Every 12 to 15 months, the same pattern appeared across multiple GPS stations simultaneously. The scientific debate around slow slip events centers on their relationship with the locked zone above them. Each slow slip episode transfers stress from the deep portion of the fault upward toward the locked interface. Whether that stress transfer meaningfully increases the probability of the locked zone rupturing during or after a slow slip episode is an active research question. Some studies suggest a correlation between slow slip timing and small earthquake clusters in the region above the slow slip zone. Others find the correlation too weak to be statistically significant. What slow slip events confirmed was that the Cascadia Fault is far from static. Even between major earthquakes, the fault system is in constant motion at depth. The locked zone is the exception, the segment that holds rather than slides. Everything around it is moving. Stress flows through the system continuously, redistributing across fault segments and periodically nudging the locked zone from below. researchers monitoring the 2026 cluster noted that a slow slip episode had occurred in the region within the preceding year. The timing added a variable to the cluster analysis. A slow slip event that transfers stress toward the locked zone during a period of elevated surface seismicity is a combination that seismologists track carefully. Neither event alone would raise significant concern. Together, they narrow the analytical margin. The slow slip data feeds into the same regional stress models that scientists use to interpret offshore earthquake clusters, and those models pointed toward a specific piece of the fault system where stress had been building longer and in greater concentration than anywhere else along the 600-mile length. That accumulation was not uniform. Certain sections of the fault had locked more tightly than others, and when stress concentrated in a locked section for long enough, the surrounding fault system felt it. An earthquake does not stay where it happens. The energy that travels through the ground as shaking is only part of what a fault releases. The other part is stress. When one section of a fault slips, it changes the distribution of force on every connected section. The rock that had been held in place by friction on the slipped section now experiences a different loading condition. Some nearby sections gain stress, others lose it. The adjustment ripples outward through the crust. Seismologists call this Coulomb stress transfer. The concept emerged from earthquake research in the 1980s and 90s and has since become one of the central tools for understanding how seismic sequences evolve. After a major earthquake, scientists calculate which nearby fault sections received additional stress from the rupture and which sections had stress removed. The sections that gained stress become statistically more likely to rupture next. The mathematics of Coulomb stress transfer are now sophisticated enough that scientists run these calculations in near real time after significant earthquakes. The output is a stress map showing which fault segments have been loaded and by how much. Emergency planners in earthquake-prone regions use these maps to identify which areas face elevated risk in the hours, days, and weeks following a major event. The 2026 earthquake cluster off the Oregon and California coast fed into exactly this kind of analysis. Each quake in the swarm shifted the stress field slightly. Individually, the shifts were small, but a swarm that generates dozens of earthquakes over several days can produce cumulative stress changes that are meaningful at the scale of a major fault system. The locked interface of the Cascadia subduction zone sits adjacent to the region where the cluster occurred. Stress transfer calculations for the swarm place small but measurable additional loading on portions of the shallow locked zone. The numbers were below the threshold that would trigger a public warning. They were large enough to appear in the scientific analysis of what the cluster might have done to the surrounding system. Regional stress transfer is also why the distance between faults does not guarantee their independence. Two faults separated by 40 or 50 miles can still influence each other through the slow redistribution of crustal stress between events. A major rupture on one fault segment can load an adjacent segment and accelerate it toward its own failure. This interaction becomes critical when discussing the relationship between the Cascadia subduction zone and the other major fault system operating simultaneously on the west coast. One located hundreds of miles to the south, one that carries its own independent catastrophic potential, one that the geological record suggested had at least once before been triggered by events on the Cascadia fault. The possibility that two of America's most dangerous faults could interact with each other was considered fringe science only a decade ago. The evidence that emerged from deep geological analysis changed that assessment, and the mechanism behind it, the physics of how stress moves through the crust between two massive fault systems, is what made the doublet theory genuinely alarming to the seismologists who first encountered it. Between the Cascadia subduction zone to the north and the Mendocino Triple Junction to the south, an east-west scar cuts across the Pacific Ocean floor. The Blanco fracture zone runs for roughly 300 miles through the ocean, stretching from the Cascadia subduction zone in the east to open ocean in the west. It is a transform fault, meaning the plates on either side of it do not collide or pull apart. They slide horizontally past each other, like two massive slabs of rock grinding sideways in opposite directions. The behavior of a transforming fault is fundamentally different from a subduction zone in ways that go beyond mechanics. Subduction zones build mountains and volcanoes onshore as the diving plate melts deep in the mantle and the resulting magma rises to the surface. Transform faults do none of this. They simply tear the crust laterally, releasing horizontal stress without creating the topographical drama that subduction produces. The Blanco fracture zone sits in deep ocean far from population centers, and its shaking reaches shore only faintly. But it does something operationally important for scientists monitoring the Pacific Northwest. It acts as a release valve for stress that builds up at the northern edge of the Gorda Plate. The Gorda Plate is being compressed from multiple directions simultaneously. The subduction interface pushes down on it from the east. The Pacific Plate presses against it from the south. That compression creates internal deformation within the plate itself, a situation unusual enough that geologists sometimes describe the Gorda Plate as a fragmented, stressed slab rather than the coherent, rigid piece of crust that most tectonic plates resemble. As the Gorda Plate deforms internally, stress concentrates at its edges and corners. The Blanco fracture zone provides an outlet for some of that stress along the northern edge. When the fracture zone produces a swarm, as it did dramatically in December of 2021, it is releasing accumulated strain from the Gorda system in a horizontal mode. The energy goes sideways rather than upward. Understanding the Blanco fracture zone helps scientists interpret what any given cluster of offshore quakes means. A swarm centered on the fracture zone itself follows a different set of risk parameters than a swarm located at the shallow locked interface of the Cascadia subduction zone. The location and the fault mechanism, together, determine the category of concern. The 2026 cluster sat close enough to the boundary between these two systems that its precise mechanical interpretation required days of detailed analysis. Scientists needed to determine whether the quakes were occurring on the subduction interface, on internal Gorda Plate deformation faults, or on structures connected to the fracture zone. Each answer carried a different implication. The analysis that finally emerged pointed toward multiple fault structures contributing to the swarm, a finding that reflected the complexity of the region rather than providing a clean single-source explanation. That kind of multi-fault swarm is harder to model and harder to classify into a risk category. It also reflects the underlying reality that the tectonic corner of the West Coast is not a simple two-plate system. It is a multi-body problem with overlapping stress fields and interconnected fault networks. And among those networks, the most unsettling connection was not between faults in the same region. The most unsettling connection was between a fault off the coast of Oregon and a fault that runs the length of California. For decades, scientists treated the Cascadia subduction zone and the San Andreas fault as separate systems. Geographically, the reasoning was simple. The San Andreas runs through California, roughly parallel to the coast, stretching about 800 miles from the Salton Sea in the south to Cape Mendocino in the north. The Cascadia subduction zone begins at Cape Mendocino and runs northward from there. The two faults share an endpoint, meeting at the Mendocino Triple Junction, but scientists generally assumed that a rupture on one would not meaningfully trigger the other. The geological record challenged that assumption. A research team studying ancient sediment deposits and coastal subsidence data along the Pacific coast found a pattern that appeared too consistent to be coincidental. In the stratigraphic record, large Cascadia rupture events showed a statistical tendency to be accompanied by, or followed within a short period by, large rupture events on the San Andreas system. The time gap between the two events, in some historical cases, appeared to be measured in hours to days rather than years. The doublet theory, as it came to be called, proposed that a full-margin Cascadia rupture could transfer enough stress to the northern end of the San Andreas fault to push it into failure. The mechanism was Coulomb stress transfer, operating at a larger scale than the regional models scientists had previously run. A magnitude 9 earthquake on the Cascadia Fault dumps an enormous amount of energy into the crust. Some of that energy propagates southward along the coast. The northern segment of the San Andreas Fault sits at the point where the transferred stress would concentrate. Research published in 2026 examined the geological evidence for this coupling in greater detail than previous studies had attempted. Scientists pulled sediment cores from locations that could record evidence of both fault systems simultaneously, comparing the timing of turbidite deposits in the deep-sea record with evidence of San Andreas rupture events preserved in coastal lake sediments. The data showed overlap in several cases, with the uncertainty windows of both events touching or overlapping in the historical record. The study was careful to frame the finding as a statistical pattern rather than a certainty. The geological dating methods used carry uncertainties of decades to centuries for events thousands of years old, proving that two events happened within hours of each other when the dating resolution is plus or minus a century requires careful statistical treatment. The researchers concluded that the doublet scenario was plausible and supported by the available evidence, but acknowledged the data could not definitively rule out independent timing for each event. What the doublet theory introduces is a compound disaster scenario. The Pacific Northwest experiences a full Cascadia rupture. Minutes or hours later, the northern San Andreas segment fails as well. California, which had just begun processing news of a catastrophe in Oregon and Washington, faces its own major earthquake before any emergency resources have mobilized. The combined damage zone would stretch from British Columbia in the north to the San Francisco Bay Area in the south. Two of the most populated coastal regions in the country hit simultaneously. The scale of that scenario demanded its own analysis, and when scientists ran through what both ruptures would produce within the same 24-hour period, the result was an outcome that the existing emergency response infrastructure of the United States had never been designed to address. Map out the Pacific coast from Vancouver, British Columbia, to San Jose, California. Draw a line connecting all the major cities along that stretch: Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose. Over 15 million people live in that corridor. All of them sit within the projected damage zone of either the Cascadia subduction zone, the San Andreas Fault, or both. In a doublet scenario, both fault systems rupture within hours of each other. The timeline starts with the Cascadia event. The Pacific Northwest receives the full sequence: 5 minutes of shaking, instant coastal subsidence, and a tsunami reaching shore within 15 to 30 minutes. Emergency response agencies in California activate to assist. Federal resources begin mobilizing northward. Then the San Andreas northern segment ruptures. The shaking from a major San Andreas event in the northern segment would be felt most intensely in the San Francisco Bay Area, the region that experienced catastrophic destruction in 1906. Modern San Francisco has retrofitted much of its older building stock, but significant vulnerability remains. The Bay Area sits on a combination of rock, landfill, and bay mud, and different soil types respond to shaking in dramatically different ways. Areas built on bay mud or landfill, including substantial portions of the financial district and the marina neighborhood, are well documented as high liquefaction zones. The infrastructure connecting Northern California to Oregon and Washington would be compromised from both directions simultaneously. Interstate 5, the primary land corridor connecting California, Oregon, and Washington, crosses dozens of bridges and overpasses that seismic engineers have identified as deficient. A Cascadia earthquake damages the northern portion of that corridor. A San Andreas northern rupture damages the California portion. The gap in the middle narrows rapidly. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which handle the majority of container shipping for the entire western United States, sit far enough south to remain functional, but the ports of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, which are critical for Pacific Northwest supply chains, would be damaged or unusable due to tsunami flooding and earthquake destruction. Marine access to the affected region would require rerouting through undamaged southern ports and then moving goods overland through a damaged road network. The power grid across the west coast operates as an interconnected system. Large-scale simultaneous damage to transmission infrastructure in both the Pacific Northwest and Northern California would challenge the grid's ability to reroute power across surviving lines. The two regions that feed electricity to each other would both be in deficit simultaneously. Emergency planners have considered this scenario. Federal emergency response doctrine after 2005's Hurricane Katrina was redesigned around the assumption that major disasters require mutual aid from neighboring regions. A simultaneous doublet disaster eliminates the neighboring regions as aid sources. The closest unaffected major population centers would be hundreds of miles away in Southern California and inland states. The doublet scenario pushes every existing response model to its operational limit. It is the edge case that emergency managers use to test whether their plans have any capacity left after addressing the primary event. Most plans do not have that capacity. And the fundamental problem driving all of it, the reason scientists cannot issue a warning before the event, sits in a gap in earthquake science that has persisted for over a century. Every seismologist working on the 2026 offshore cluster faced the same professional boundary. They could measure everything that had already happened. They could model how stress had redistributed across the fault network. They could calculate Coulomb stress changes, compare the cluster location to historical patterns, and run probability estimates for various rupture scenarios. The science for analyzing what had occurred was sophisticated and detailed. The science for predicting what would happen next did not exist at the resolution anyone needed. Earthquake prediction, in the strict sense of specifying a time, location, and magnitude before an event occurs, remains beyond the current capability of seismology. Scientists have been working on the problem for over a century. Short-term prediction, giving reliable public warnings hours or days before a major event. The fundamental difficulty is that the precursors to an earthquake, the stress buildup, the microseismic activity, the slow slip, look almost identical to conditions that persist for decades without producing a major rupture. Foreshock identification is the most immediate version of this problem. The 2026 cluster could be producing foreshocks right now. The seismologists analyzing it would not know that definitively until the main event either happened or did not happen. After the fact, if a major earthquake struck, the cluster would be reclassified as a foreshock sequence. If no major event followed, it would be recorded as a swarm. The data going into each classification is the same data, only the outcome changes the name. This uncertainty shapes emergency communication in a way that is genuinely difficult to navigate. Issuing a public warning based on an unconfirmed foreshock sequence would trigger evacuation of coastal areas, disrupt commerce and transportation, and erode public trust if no major earthquake followed. Withholding concern when a cluster occurs near a major locked fault risks leaving coastal communities unprepared if the cluster is actually the beginning of something larger. Scientists and emergency managers navigate this by communicating elevated awareness rather than specific warnings. The language used in official statements during the 2026 swarm reflected that balance. Monitoring was described as intensified. Residents in coastal zones were reminded of existing preparation protocols. The standard guidance, know your evacuation route, keep emergency supplies ready, and respond to prolonged shaking by moving to high ground immediately, was restated. That guidance was correct regardless of what the cluster was. The preparation for a foreshock sequence and the preparation for an ordinary swarm are identical because the appropriate response to a major Cascadia earthquake does not depend on receiving advance warning. It depends on recognizing the shaking itself as the signal. The 2026 cluster kept scientists watching not because the data was conclusive in either direction. It kept them watching because the location, the fault mechanics, and the regional stress context placed it in the category of swarms that deserved sustained monitoring, rather than routine logging. And overhanging all of that analysis was a historical fact that the data could not change. The Cascadia subduction zone had not fully ruptured in over 300 years. The historical average put the next rupture within a window that had already opened. Whether the fault would stay locked for another decade or another century was unknowable. But what would happen when it finally moved was not unknown at all. Not every Cascadia earthquake has to be a magnitude 9. This is a critical point inside the scientific debate about the next rupture. The fault is 600 miles long, but it does not have to fail along its entire length to produce a major earthquake. Shorter fault segments can rupture independently, releasing less energy over a smaller area. A southern segment rupture, for example, involving only the portion of the fault from Cape Mendocino to southern Oregon, could produce a magnitude 8 event rather than a full 9. A magnitude 8 earthquake is still catastrophic. The shaking would be severe, infrastructure damage would be significant, a tsunami would likely form, though its height and reach would be smaller than a full margin event. The disaster would be major by any historical standard. But the difference between a magnitude 8 and a magnitude 9 in terms of energy is enormous. That single number difference represents roughly 30 times more energy released. The duration of shaking, the extent of coastal subsidence, the height of the resulting tsunami, and the geographic footprint of the destruction all scale with the size of the rupture. A full margin 9 hits every coastal community, from Crescent City to Victoria, simultaneously. A southern segment 8 hits a subset of that coast with less force. The debate over which scenario is more likely for the next Cascadia event centers on evidence from the historical record. Some of the turbidite layers in the seafloor cores document events that appear to have involved only the southern portion of the fault. These layers are thinner, appear in cores from southern sites but not northern ones, and correspond to events with shorter estimated durations of shaking. Researchers have interpreted these as segment ruptures rather than full margin events. The full margin events, like 1700, appear as thick turbidite layers correlated across cores from both the northern and southern sections of the fault simultaneously. The correlation of the event layer across the full 600-mile length distinguishes the full margin events from the segment ruptures. The historical record suggests that segment ruptures occur more frequently than full margin events. The shorter recurrence interval for some southern segment events may mean that the southern Cascadia fault is more likely to rupture next. It may also mean that the southern segment has already released some of its accumulated stress in more recent segment events, leaving the northern segment as the section most loaded with unspent energy. The honest answer that seismologists give when asked which scenario comes next is that both remain plausible. The fault has done both before. The current state of strain measurement across the locked zone does not yet provide enough resolution to determine which sections are most critically loaded. Improved ocean bottom seismometer networks and more sophisticated GPS strain analysis are closing that gap, but have not yet closed it entirely. Emergency planning treats both scenarios. The plans for a southern segment event differ significantly from plans for a full margin event because the affected regions, the required resources, and the tsunami inundation zones are all different. Coastal communities from Crescent City to Astoria plan for both because the determination of which rupture occurred would come from seismic data interpreted after the shaking had already begun. What the sensors on the seafloor and the GPS networks onshore are actually measuring, and how that data translates from raw signal to actionable science, explains why the monitoring network surrounding the 2026 cluster mattered as much as the cluster itself. Scattered across the ocean floor off the Pacific Northwest coast, hundreds of instruments sit in complete darkness. They are part of a network called the Ocean Observatories Initiative, a system of seafloor sensors, hydrophones, and pressure gauges that monitor the Cascadia subduction zone continuously. Some are anchored to the ocean bottom at depths exceeding 2 miles. Others sit on the continental shelf in shallower water, directly above the most critical sections of the locked fault. Together, they form one of the most sophisticated underwater monitoring arrays on the planet. Each instrument records different types of information. Seismometers detect ground motion in the seafloor rock itself, capturing even tiny earthquakes that would never register at onshore stations, because the distance is too great and the signal too weak. Hydrophones record pressure waves traveling through the water column, picking up acoustic signals from fault movements that generate sound in the ocean rather than conventional seismic waves. Bottom pressure gauges measure the weight of the water column above them, which changes when the seafloor moves vertically. That vertical movement detection is the critical capability. A sudden rise or drop in seafloor elevation beneath a bottom pressure gauge registers as an immediate change in the overlying water pressure. If a section of the Cascadia Fault lunged upward during a rupture, the pressure gauges sitting above it would detect the displacement within seconds. That signal, transmitted acoustically to surface buoys and then via satellite to onshore monitoring centers, is the earliest possible automated detection of a Cascadia tsunami in progress. The detection to warning chain matters enormously because of the short evacuation windows for coastal communities. Every second between the seafloor movement and the activation of coastal warning sirens is a second of evacuation time saved or lost. Tsunami warning centers in Palmer, Alaska, and in Iwa Beach, Hawaii, process the incoming sensor data and issue warnings based on the detected parameters of any submarine event. For a local Cascadia earthquake, where the wave reaches shore in 15 to 30 minutes, the warning chain faces its harshest test. An earthquake felt by people on the coast provides its own immediate warning through the shaking itself. The sensor network becomes more valuable for communities slightly farther from the fault, where the wave arrives later and where the ground motion may have been strong but not immediately recognized as a Cascadia event. The onshore GPS network adds another dimension to the monitoring system. The same sensors that detect slow slip events and track interseismic strain also respond to the rapid ground displacement that occurs during a major earthquake. The GPS displacement data from a large earthquake helps scientists determine almost immediately whether the fault moved vertically, how much the ground shifted, and which section of the fault appears to have ruptured. That information feeds into the tsunami warning assessment alongside the seafloor pressure data. The 2026 cluster had both networks focused on the same stretch of coast. Onshore seismometers were tracking the swarm. Offshore instruments were monitoring seafloor conditions. The combined data stream gave scientists a denser picture of what was happening at the Gorda Plate than would have been available even a decade earlier. What none of those instruments could resolve, for the cluster or for the background loading of the Cascadia Fault itself, was the question of when. The sensors measured state. They did not measure schedule, and the schedule for the next Cascadia rupture was something that history had already constrained in a way that made the current moment unusual. The Cascadia subduction zone last fully ruptured on January 26, 1700. 325 years have passed. The historical record from sediment cores suggests the fault ruptures roughly every 450 to 500 years on average. That average comes from counting and dating the full margin rupture events preserved in the turbidite record over the past 10,000 years. 19 to 20 events across 10,000 years produces that recurrence interval. 325 years out of 450 to 500 means the fault is well inside its historical window. Scientists are precise about what that statement does and does not mean. Being inside the historical window means that the probability of rupture is meaningfully higher than it would be immediately after a major earthquake, when the fault has just released its stored energy and needs time to reload. The window does not mean the earthquake is imminent in any specific sense. It means the fault is in a phase where the accumulated stress is reaching the range at which past events have occurred. Earthquake probability works on a different timescale than most people use to think about risk. Scientists express Cascadia hazard estimates over spans of 50 years or decades, rather than years. Research published by the United States Geological Survey and university seismology groups has estimated roughly a 30% probability of a major Cascadia rupture in the next 50 years. Some estimates, using different assumptions on the recurrence interval, place the number higher. A 30% probability over 50 years sounds abstract until you apply it to familiar risk comparisons. Most people would not board a commercial aircraft if they were told there was a 30% chance of a crash on the flight. Most people would not live in a building if there was a 30% chance it would experience a major structural failure within their lifetime. The probability of a Cascadia rupture within the next 50 years sits in that same numerical range. The historical record also shows that the recurrence interval has variability. Some gaps between Cascadia events were shorter than 450 years. Some were longer. The fault has gone through periods of higher activity and periods of relative quiet. The current gap of 325 years falls within the shorter end of the observed range, meaning past events have occurred at this elapsed time since the previous rupture. Preparedness researchers who study this data argue that the 300-year elapsed time and the historical recurrence interval together make the Pacific Northwest the single highest priority region in the country for seismic preparedness investment. The infrastructure gaps, the population vulnerability, and the geological certainty that a major earthquake will occur, even if its precise timing is unknown, combine into a risk profile that has drawn significant attention from seismologists and policy analysts alike. The comparison that gives this number the most emotional weight comes from a different part of the Pacific. A country on the other side of the ocean had already experienced what the Pacific Northwest models project. It had experienced it recently, and the way it unfolded, the sequence of shaking, subsidence, and wave, was nearly identical to what Cascadia would produce. On March 11, 2011, the Tohoku earthquake struck the seafloor off the northeastern coast of Japan. The fault that produced it was a subduction zone. The Pacific Plate was diving beneath the North American Plate at that location, locked and loaded in exactly the same configuration as the Cascadia subduction zone. The earthquake reached a magnitude of 9.0. The fault ruptured across a length of roughly 300 miles of locked interface. The shaking lasted approximately 6 minutes. The parallels to the Cascadia scenario are specific and well documented. The shaking duration, the vertical displacement of the seafloor, the rapid coastal subsidence in the areas directly above the rupture, the tsunami that followed. Scientists studying Cascadia hazard have used the Tohoku event as the closest modern analog available for what a full Cascadia rupture would produce. The Tohoku tsunami reached heights of over 100 feet at its most extreme points, specifically in narrow inlet areas where the local geometry concentrated the wave energy. Entire coastal communities were inundated. The wave penetrated miles inland through river valleys. In some locations, the tsunami destroyed everything up to the elevation markers that towns had erected after previous historical tsunamis, markers placed specifically to warn future generations about the maximum safe elevation. The subsidence aspect of the Tohoku earthquake matched the Cascadia models closely. Coastal land in the most affected areas dropped by several feet within seconds of the rupture. Some areas experienced subsidence of up to 4 feet, which permanently altered drainage patterns and put previously dry land below the tidal zone. Recovery efforts in those areas required either elevating the ground or relocating communities entirely. Japan had extensive tsunami preparedness infrastructure in place before the event. Seawall systems, evacuation routes, tsunami warning signage, and public education programs were significantly more developed than equivalent systems on the Pacific Northwest coast. The evacuation that occurred saved tens of thousands of lives. The people who followed the protocols and reached high ground survived. Many of those who delayed or returned to lower ground after initial shaking did not. The lesson that emergency managers in the Pacific Northwest drew from Tohoku was not that preparation is futile, the lesson was the opposite. The deaths that occurred mostly involved people who did not follow the protocols, who returned to low-lying areas too soon, or who were in locations where the wave arrived faster than any warning system could provide. The protocols themselves worked. The Pacific Northwest lacks Japan's seawall infrastructure and has a smaller proportion of its coastal population with detailed knowledge of tsunami evacuation procedures. The Tohoku event became the reference case for arguing that those gaps needed to be closed before, not after, the next major subduction earthquake. The infrastructure discussion leads directly to the question of what is actually at risk in a Cascadia earthquake scenario: the buildings, the bridges, the highways, the hospitals, the physical layer of the Pacific Northwest that millions of people depend on every day. A major Cascadia earthquake would not just shake buildings, it would hit a specific inventory of aging, seismically vulnerable infrastructure concentrated in exactly the area that would experience the strongest shaking and the most severe ground conditions. That inventory has been documented by state and federal engineering assessments, and the picture it creates is one of compounding failures rather than isolated damage. Bridges come first. Oregon alone has identified hundreds of highway bridges that fail to meet current seismic standards. Many of these bridges sit on Interstate 5 and the coastal highway routes that emergency vehicles, evacuation traffic, and supply chains all depend on. During a major Cascadia earthquake, the ground shaking would subject those bridges to forces they were not designed to handle. A significant fraction would sustain damage severe enough to close them to traffic. Some would fail completely. The distribution of those bridges matters as much as their number. Damaged bridges do not just block individual roads, they sever entire corridors. A single failed bridge on a mountain pass eliminates the route between the coast and the inland population centers that would serve as evacuation destinations and aid staging areas. With multiple bridges failing simultaneously across the region, the transportation network fragments. Communities that seem close on a map become unreachable by road. Hospitals present a separate category of problem. Seismic assessments of Pacific Northwest hospitals have found that many older acute care facilities were built before modern earthquake codes and retain structural systems that perform poorly in major seismic events. A magnitude 9 Cascadia earthquake, with its prolonged 5-minute shaking duration, would expose hospital buildings to sustained cyclic loading that older reinforced concrete structures are particularly vulnerable to. If hospitals are damaged or destroyed at the moment of maximum need, the capacity to treat earthquake and tsunami casualties collapses precisely when demand peaks. Field hospitals can be established, but the timeline for setting them up and staffing them with adequate personnel measures in days, not hours. The electrical grid presents a third category. Transmission towers and high-voltage lines run through terrain that would experience intense shaking, and in some coastal areas, tsunami inundation. Substations sitting in low-elevation coastal zones face both seismic damage and flooding. The interconnected nature of the Western grid means that widespread damage in the Pacific Northwest could cascade into power fluctuations affecting neighboring regions. Water systems in Pacific Northwest cities rely on infrastructure that runs through or adjacent to zones of high liquefaction risk. Water mains running through areas that liquefy during prolonged shaking are subject to failure along their entire length within a liquefaction zone, not just at isolated points. Portland, which sits on soils with significant liquefaction potential in many of its river-adjacent neighborhoods, could experience widespread water main failures across a large portion of the city simultaneously. The combination of bridge failures, hospital damage, grid disruptions, and water system failures arriving simultaneously defines the emergency management challenge. Each individual failure is manageable. All of them at once, across a region stretching from Northern California to British Columbia, strains every mutual aid agreement and federal resource allocation system that exists. Emergency planners have modeled the response requirements. They have also modeled the gap between what is needed and what is available. That gap is significant, and the plans built to address it depend heavily on evacuation routes and warning systems that have their own documented shortcomings. The blueprint exists. Emergency managers in Oregon, Washington, and California have spent years building earthquake and tsunami evacuation plans for coastal communities. The plans include designated routes, assembly points, vertical evacuation structures for communities where reaching high ground quickly is impossible, and public signage directing residents towards safety. Oregon has installed tsunami hazard zone signs along coastal roads, blue and white markers that tell drivers they are in an inundation zone and point the direction to higher ground. Some coastal communities have built vertical evacuation towers, reinforced concrete structures tall enough to put people above the projected tsunami inundation height, designed for communities sitting on flat coastal land with no accessible hillside within the available evacuation time. The vertical evacuation structures represent a direct acknowledgement of a specific gap in the conventional evacuation plan. Some Pacific Northwest coastal communities sit on flat ground where the nearest high terrain is miles away. For the residents of those communities, reaching high ground before the wave arrives is mathematically impossible given the 15 to 30-minute window. The towers provide a survivable alternative. The gaps in the overall plan fall into several categories. Public awareness is the first. Studies conducted by Oregon Sea Grant and university research groups have found that a significant fraction of people in high-risk coastal zones are unaware of their evacuation route, have never walked or driven the route, and do not know how long it would take them to reach safety. Knowing that evacuation routes exist and knowing how to use them are different levels of preparedness. Nighttime readiness is the second gap. Many people sleep through moderate shaking. A major Cascadia earthquake strong enough to trigger evacuation would almost certainly wake everyone in the coastal zone. But the disorientation of being woken from sleep, the darkness if power is lost immediately, and the time required to account for family members before beginning evacuation all reduce the effective evacuation time available. Special needs populations represent the third major gap. Hospitals, nursing homes, hotels with tourists unfamiliar with local evacuation protocols, campgrounds, and mobile home parks in coastal areas all contain people who cannot self-evacuate quickly and who require coordinated assistance. The plans for assisting those populations depend on emergency personnel and transportation assets that will themselves be navigating a damaged transportation network. The plan also assumes that the roads remain passable long enough for people to use them. Some coastal evacuation routes cross bridges or run through low-lying areas that would experience liquefaction or direct tsunami flooding within the available time window. If the primary evacuation route fails before the population clears it, the plan requires an immediate pivot to alternatives that many residents are not aware of. Post-Tohoku analysis of what worked and what failed in Japanese evacuation added specific lessons to Pacific Northwest planning. The communities that evacuated most successfully shared one characteristic. Residents knew their route before the earthquake happened and began moving during or immediately after the shaking without waiting for an official siren or alert. The communities with higher casualties included places where people had not been trained to recognize prolonged shaking itself as the evacuation signal. That recognition, that the shaking is the warning, is the single most important piece of earthquake preparedness information for anyone living in the Pacific Northwest coastal zone. And the energy contained in that warning signal, the geological force driving the shaking, is almost beyond any comparison a person normally uses. A magnitude 9 earthquake is difficult to picture in terms of raw energy. Numbers help if they come with a reference point. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945 released an amount of energy equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of conventional explosive. Scientists often use that figure as a benchmark because it is the largest single explosive event most people have encountered in any historical context. A magnitude 9 earthquake releases energy equivalent to approximately 25,000 atomic bombs of that size, all of it delivered in a single 5-minute event. Every bit of that energy travels outward through the crust, through the water, and into the structures and landscapes above the fault. The energy does not distribute evenly. It concentrates in the waves it produces. Seismic waves, the body waves that travel through the rock, and the surface waves that roll along the ground, carry the energy outward from the rupture in all directions. The surface waves are what people feel as shaking. They arrive as a sequence of wave types, each with different characteristics. The first waves cause the ground to compress and expand. The later surface waves cause the ground to roll and sway in ways that are particularly destructive to tall buildings. At 100 miles from the epicenter of a magnitude 9, the shaking is still severe enough to cause major structural damage to vulnerable buildings. At 200 miles, the shaking intensity has diminished, but remains strong enough to topple unreinforced masonry structures and damage older bridges. At 500 miles, the shaking is perceptible and potentially damaging to the most vulnerable structures. A Cascadia rupture would be felt from Alaska to Northern California. The seafloor displacement that generates the tsunami concentrates the rupture energy into the water column in a different way. The vertical movement of the seafloor over the full rupture area transfers an enormous amount of energy into the ocean almost instantaneously. Scientists estimate the total water displacement from a full Cascadia rupture would involve billions of tons of seawater set into motion simultaneously. That displaced water carries the energy across the Pacific Ocean in multiple directions. The wave that travels toward the Pacific Northwest coast arrives as the local tsunami. A wave also propagates westward toward Hawaii, arriving there several hours after the rupture. Another wave propagates southward toward California and eventually toward South America. Tsunami warning centers coordinate alerts across all of these recipient regions from the moment the event is detected. The total energy budget of a magnitude 9 earthquake, from the seismic waves to the tsunami to the local ground deformation, represents a geological force that human engineering has never been designed to fully withstand at close range. The Pacific Northwest's building codes, bridge standards, and infrastructure design have all been progressively updated toward better seismic performance. The gap between current standards and the force a Cascadia event would deliver remains significant. Understanding the force quantitatively prepares emergency planners. It also prepares the public to understand why the recovery from a full Cascadia rupture would take years, not months, and why the landscape and daily life of the Pacific Northwest would look fundamentally different in the years following the event. The immediate aftermath of a full Cascadia rupture would look like this. The coastal zone from Northern California to British Columbia goes dark. Power is out across most of the affected region. Roads are blocked by collapsed overpasses, debris flows, and in the lowest coastal areas, receding tsunami water carrying mud and wreckage. The roads that remain passable are jammed with vehicles attempting to move in multiple directions at once, some evacuating, some attempting to reach family, some not yet understanding what has happened. The tsunami inundation zone along the coast covers everything below the projected wave heights. In the hardest hit areas, where the wave reached 50 to 100 feet, the physical destruction is total. No structure at those elevations survived. The coastal towns that existed in those zones exist only in records and memories. The land beneath them may now be tidal mudflat due to subsidence. Rebuilding is not a question of repairing structures, it is a question of whether the ground those structures stood on still exists at its original function. In the first 72 hours, the challenge is search and rescue. The population that did not reach high ground in time and survived the wave, in some cases would require immediate extraction from debris, from flooded structures, and from isolated high ground areas where the surrounding roads are impassable. Helicopter assets become critical because land routes are severed. The number of helicopter-accessible landing points in the affected coastal area is limited. Prioritizing them against the scale of need requires triage decisions that no mass casualty training exercise has fully replicated. Water is the first supply crisis. Municipal water systems in the affected area are damaged. Groundwater near the coast is contaminated by saltwater intrusion following both the tsunami flooding and the coastal subsidence. Emergency water distribution requires trucks on roads that are damaged. For inland communities less directly hit by the tsunami but still affected by the earthquake, the water infrastructure failure is serious and prolonged. In the months that follow, the recovery divides into two parallel tracks. The inland and higher elevation communities damaged by shaking, but not tsunami inundation, begin a conventional disaster recovery process, demolishing destroyed structures, repairing infrastructure, restoring utilities, and rebuilding housing. This process, based on historical precedents from other major earthquakes, takes years. The coastal communities hit by both the earthquake and the tsunami face a fundamentally different challenge. The land itself has changed. Subsided areas must either be raised, which requires importing massive volumes of fill material, or abandoned. New flood mapping must be completed to determine what is now permanently below the tidal zone before any reconstruction can be sited. Insurance settlements for properties that no longer have the land they were built on, present legal and financial puzzles, without clear precedent in American disaster law. Full economic recovery from a major Cascadia event has been modeled at a timeline of 10 to 30 years for the most severely affected areas. The economic loss estimates for a full margin rupture, including property damage, infrastructure replacement, and economic disruption, run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. All of that projection connects back to the beginning of this story, to the morning monitors lit up across Pacific Northwest seismological stations, to the magnitude 5.7 that cracked the seafloor 85 miles off the Oregon coast, to the cluster that followed, and to the question that scientists are still working through: what exactly does that cluster mean for what comes next? The 2026 cluster is still being analyzed. The monitoring networks that recorded the initial magnitude 5.7 and the subsequent swarm have continued logging every aftershock, every micro-earthquake, and every subtle change in ground position across the Pacific Northwest GPS network. The data stream from offshore sensors continues around the clock. They are watching it evolve. Several specific signals would push the situation from elevated monitoring to something requiring a different level of public communication. A significant acceleration in swarm frequency would be the first. If the rate of earthquakes in the cluster began increasing rapidly, with quakes arriving faster and faster over a short period, that acceleration pattern would draw immediate attention. Most harmless swarms show a gradual decay in frequency after the largest initial event. An acceleration trend runs counter to that pattern. A change in the depth distribution of the quakes would be the second signal. If the cluster began migrating shallower, with quakes concentrating closer and closer to the seafloor surface, that migration could indicate stress concentrating at the most critical section of the fault. Depth migration in a swarm is not a reliable predictor of a larger event, but it is a pattern that appears in some foreshock sequences and would be tracked closely. A large, single earthquake significantly bigger than the initial 5.7 would change the analysis immediately. A magnitude 6 or above in the same cluster location would represent a substantial step up in energy release and would trigger a formal reassessment of the regional hazard level, along with public notification of elevated awareness from Pacific Northwest emergency management agencies. Beyond the immediate cluster, the broader scientific community continues working on the long-term monitoring improvements that could close some of the gaps in real-time earthquake analysis. Expanded ocean bottom seismometer networks are being planned for the Cascadia subduction zone, with the goal of providing continuous coverage of the locked interface at the resolution needed to detect stress concentration before a rupture. Better offshore sensor coverage would narrow the analytical uncertainty around clusters like the one in 2026. Researchers are also refining the slow slip monitoring data trying to determine whether the timing and location of episodic tremor and slip events correlates with subsequent surface cluster activity in a statistically meaningful way. If a consistent relationship can be established, slow slip monitoring could become an early component of a regional hazard assessment system. For the communities sitting along the 600-mile coastline above the Cascadia subduction zone, none of these monitoring improvements change the essential preparation calculus. The next major Cascadia earthquake will not be announced in advance. The warning will be the shaking. The response to that warning is the only variable that human action can currently control. Know the evacuation route. Know the elevation of the ground beneath you. Know that prolonged, strong shaking near the Pacific Northwest coast is the signal. Move immediately. Move upward. Move away from the water. 325 years of stored energy sits beneath that coastline. The sediment cores, the ghost forests, the Japanese tsunami records, and the fire pits buried under ancient mud all say the same thing. The fault has done this before. The fault will do it again. The monitors are still watching.